The night stretched gently around them, soft and unhurried, like it too understood that some moments shouldn't be rushed. Ben didn't move when Annie stepped beside him. He simply leaned a little closer, their shoulders brushing in that familiar, effortless way that comes only after years of shared life. "You've gone quiet," Annie said, tilting her head slightly as she studied him. "I was just thinking," Ben replied. "Dangerous," she teased, a small smile forming. He laughed under his breath. "Yeah, happens once a year. Special occasions only." But the truth ran deeper than that. Because birthdays had a way of doing this to him lately, making him pause, reflect, look backward as much as forward. Not with regret, but with a kind of quiet wonder. How had it all gone so fast? The early days they never talk about. There were parts of their story that never made it into interviews. Moments too ordinary for headlines, yet too meaningful to forget. Tiny flats with unreliable heating. Shared dinners that were more, what's left in the fridge, than planned meals. Arguments over nothing. Who forgot to pay a bill, who left the lights on, who was too tired to talk. Back then, Ben hadn't been Ben Shephard from. He'd just been trying. Trying to break into television. Trying to prove himself. Trying to figure out where he fit. And Annie, she had already figured something out that he hadn't. That success wasn't about recognition. It was about stability. About building something that lasts. When dreams meet reality, there was a moment, Ben could still remember it clearly, when everything nearly overwhelmed him. He had just landed a bigger role on television. The kind of opportunity he had dreamed about for years. But with it came pressure. Long hours. Constant scrutiny. The fear of failure creeping in at the edges of every day. One night, he came home later than usual. The house was quiet. Annie was sitting on the sofa, a lamp glowing beside her, sketches spread out across the table, design plans for a project she had been working on. She looked up. "You okay?" she asked. He hesitated. That was always the moment, wasn't it? The choice between saying, "I'm fine," and telling the truth. "I don't know if I'm good enough," he admitted. The words hung in the air, heavier than he expected. Annie didn't rush to fill the silence. She didn't offer clichés. She simply set her pencil down and said, "Then we'll figure it out." That word had carried them through more than either of them realized at the time. The balance they built over the years, they had learned something many couples struggle to understand. Balance isn't about splitting everything equally. It's about knowing when to carry more so the other doesn't have to. When Ben's career demanded more of him, Annie steadied the home. When Annie faced her own challenges, Ben stepped back and made space. There was no scoreboard, no keeping track, just an unspoken agreement. We've got each other. Growing through change, do you ever miss it? Annie asked suddenly, pulling him back to the present. Miss what? The early days. Ben thought for a moment. Parts of it, he admitted. But I don't think I'd trade this. She nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Because life now was fuller. More complex. More demanding. But also richer in ways they couldn't have imagined back then. Their sons, Sam and Jack, were no longer children. They were becoming their own people, shaping their own futures. And that brought a different kind of emotion. Pride, yes, but also something quieter. A subtle ache. The bittersweet shift. The house had started to change. Not physically, but emotionally. There were more closed doors now. More independence. More moments when the boys didn't need them in the same way. Ben had noticed it first in the small things. Fewer family movie nights. More time spent in their rooms. Shorter conversations at the dinner table. At first, he resisted it. Tried to hold on to what had been. But Annie, she adapted. Of course she did. She always did. They're supposed to grow, she had said gently one evening when Ben mentioned it. I know, he replied. I just didn't think it would happen this quickly. She smiled. It always does. The strength no one sees. Earlier that day, when Ben had written his birthday message, he had mentioned the boys' exams. A- levels. GCSEs. Milestones that felt as big as anything they had faced before. But what he hadn't fully said What he hadn't quite been able to capture in a few lines was just how much Annie had given during that time. The late nights, the quiet encouragement, the steady presence when stress threatened to take over. Ben had watched it all unfold. And every time, he found himself thinking the same thing: how does she do it? Because Annie didn't just support. She understood. She knew when to push, when to step back, when to simply be there. And that kind of intuition, you can't teach it. A private love in a public world, being in the public eye, had never been easy. Ben knew that. He lived it every day. The recognition, the expectations, the constant sense of being watched. But Annie had chosen something different. She had chosen privacy, not out of fear, but out of clarity. She knew what mattered, and it wasn't attention, it was authenticity. Their relationship didn't exist for anyone else's approval. It existed because it worked. Because they worked. A conversation that says everything. Did you mean what you wrote? Annie asked softly. Ben looked at her. Every word. She studied his face, as if searching for something deeper beneath the answer. And the part about the boys? He smiled. That was the most honest bit. She shook her head lightly. You give me too much credit. Not even close, he replied. And he meant it. Because love isn't just about saying the right things. It's about seeing clearly. And Ben saw Annie for exactly who she was. The future, unwritten. Do you ever think about what comes next? Ben asked. All the time, Annie said. And, she paused. I think it's going to be different. That sounds ominous. It's not, she smiled. Just quieter, maybe. Ben considered that. Quieter. It wasn't something he had ever associated with their life. But maybe she was right. Maybe the next chapter wouldn't be about raising children or building careers. Maybe it would be about rediscovering something they hadn't had time for in years. Each other. Returning to where it began. Do you remember? Ben asked suddenly. Annie laughed softly. Of course I do. How could I forget? Maybe we should go back. She raised an eyebrow. For my birthday. Why not? She looked at him for a moment, then nodded. I'd like that. And just like that, the idea settled between them. Not as a grand plan, but as a quiet promise. The meaning behind it all later, as they turned off the lights and made their way upstairs, Ben felt something he hadn't quite been able to name all day. Not nostalgia, not even happiness, exactly. Something steadier, something deeper. Gratitude. For the years behind them. For the moments that had shaped them. For the challenges they had faced, and overcome. And most of all, for Annie. The next morning sunlight filtered through the curtains, soft and golden. Ben woke first, as he often did. He lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet rhythm of the house. Then he turned his head. Annie was still asleep, her expression peaceful, untouched by the rush of the outside world. He smiled, because this simple, ordinary moment, was everything. Not the television studios, not the public recognition, not the milestones or achievements. Just this, a life shared, a love that had endured. And still, it continues downstairs, the day would begin again. Breakfast, conversations, the familiar chaos of family life. But something had shifted, not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would notice, but in a way that mattered. Because sometimes, all it takes is a birthday, a photo. A few honest words, to remind you of what's always been there. And what always will be. And as Ben reached for his phone once more, glancing at the post that had started it all, he realized something simple but profound. The world might see a presenter. A public figure, a familiar face on morning television. But behind it all, he was just a man who got lucky. Lucky enough to meet the right person at the right time. And wise enough to hold on. To Annie, to their family, to the life they had built, quietly, steadily. The sea had that quiet, knowing calm about it that morning, like it had witnessed countless love stories and kept every secret safe beneath its shifting tides. Along the rugged coastline the wind carried whispers of salt and memory, brushing softly against the old stone walls of the hotel where, years ago, a young couple had stood hand in hand and promised forever. Now, more than 2 decades later, that promise still held. Inside a warm, sunlit kitchen miles away from that coastline, stood by the window, staring at his phone with a faint smile tugging at his lips. The world knew him as the polished presenter from, calm, composed, always ready with the next question. But here, at home, he was simply Ben. A husband, a father, a man quietly overwhelmed by how quickly life had moved. He scrolled through his camera roll, pausing on a photo he'd taken not long ago. In it, his wife, stood bathed in natural light, her face turned slightly away from the lens. She wasn't posing. She never really did. That was Annie, unassuming, effortlessly elegant, and entirely unaware of just how much she meant to the people around her. Ben exhaled softly. "So it's Mrs. S's birthday," he murmured, already hearing the words forming in his mind as they would soon appear on Instagram. But this wasn't just another birthday post. This one felt different. The quiet strength behind the spotlight. Ben had never been the kind to overshare his private life. Fame had a way of taking more than it gave, and he'd learned early on that some things, the most important things, needed protecting. And Annie was at the very top of that list. They had met years ago, long before the bright studio lights, before early morning call times, before millions of viewers tuned in to watch him speak. Back then, they were just two students navigating university life, dreams still forming, futures uncertain. "I was a mere puppy," Ben had once joked during a conversation on With. And it was true. He had ambition, yes, but Annie had something else entirely. She had clarity. Where Ben saw possibilities, Annie saw direction. Where he hesitated, she steadied him. And where the world would later try to pull him in 100 different directions, she would become his anchor. "She's been through all this with me," he had said. The highs and the lows. What he hadn't said, but always felt, was that those highs wouldn't have meant nearly as much without her. And those lows, they would have been far harder to survive. A life built together. Their wedding in March 2004 had been intimate, windswept, and perfect in its simplicity. No excessive glamour, no spectacle, just love, the kind that doesn't need to prove itself. Over the years, that love grew, not in grand, cinematic gestures, but in the quiet, everyday moments that truly define a relationship. Morning coffees shared in silence. Late-night conversations after the children had gone to bed. The occasional disagreement that ended not with shouting, but with understanding. And then, of course, came the boys. Sam and Jack. Their world shifted the moment they arrived, not in a way that broke anything, but in a way that expanded everything. Ben remembered holding each of them for the first time, feeling a mix of awe and fear. How could something so small suddenly matter so much? And Annie, she seemed to step into motherhood as though she had always been meant for it. Calm, patient, unwavering. The invisible work of love now, years later, as Sam prepared for his A-levels and Jack tackled his GCSEs, the house buzzed with a different kind of energy. Stress, anticipation, hope. Ben had tried to help where he could, quizzing them, offering encouragement, occasionally attempting to explain things he barely remembered himself. But he knew the truth. The real credit belonged to Annie. There is no doubt the results they got were down to her, he would later write. And it wasn't just about homework or revision schedules. It was about the countless unseen efforts. The early mornings, the quiet reassurances, the way she noticed when one of them was struggling, even before they said a word. Ben leaned against the counter, shaking his head slightly with a soft laugh. "I'd like to think I helped in some way," he whispered, mostly in the knowledge that they did better than me. A birthday, a reflection. He sat down at the kitchen table, phone in hand, and began typing. "So it's Mrs. S' birthday. Can't believe another year has gone by. Not sure where the time goes." It was simple, honest, very him, but as he continued, the words began to carry more weight. This one bigger than most, because it was. Their sons were growing up. Life was shifting again. The years weren't just passing, they were transforming. With Sam and Jack doing A-levels and GCSEs. He paused, glancing toward the hallway where faint sounds of movement hinted at the boys getting ready for the day. Time, That was the thing, wasn't it? It never stopped. And yet, somehow, Annie had managed to keep everything steady within it. The woman behind the smile, the photo he had chosen, captured Annie in a rare moment of stillness. She wasn't looking at the camera. She wasn't trying to impress anyone. She was just being. And that was exactly what made it perfect. To the outside world, Annie Shephard remained something of a mystery. She wasn't on television. She didn't seek attention. Her work as an interior designer spoke quietly for itself. Spaces transformed not just aesthetically, but emotionally. She understood how environments shaped people. How light, texture, and space could influence the way someone felt. In many ways, she approached life the same way. Thoughtfully, intentionally. She didn't need the spotlight. She created warmth instead. Love in the everyday. Ben finished typing the caption, adding a final touch, "Anyway at Annie Shephard Design, happy birthday." He read it back once, then again. It wasn't poetic. It wasn't overly sentimental. But it was real. And that mattered more. He hit post and set his phone down, exhaling as though he had just said something important out loud. Because, in a way, he had. Moments that matter. Later that day, as the house filled with the familiar rhythm of family life, Annie walked into the kitchen, her expression curious. "Why is my phone exploding?" she asked, half laughing. Ben looked up, feigning innocence. "No idea," he replied, though the grin on his face gave him away. She checked her notifications, scrolling through the messages, the comments, the well wishes. And then she saw the post. For a moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at him. There was no dramatic reaction. No tears. No grand declaration. Just a quiet, understanding smile. "Thank you," she said softly. And in those two words was everything. The highs and the lows. Life hadn't always been easy. There had been moments, private, unspoken, when things felt uncertain. Times when Ben's demanding career pulled him in different directions. Times when exhaustion crept in and patience wore thin. But through it all, they had remained a team. Not perfect, but committed. And that commitment made all the difference. Ben had once described their journey as something they had been through together. Not something they had simply experienced, but something they had actively navigated, side by side. That distinction mattered, because love isn't just about being there when things are easy. It's about staying when they're not. A glimpse into forever. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the family gathered around the table for a simple birthday dinner. Nothing extravagant, just good food, shared laughter, and the kind of comfort that can't be bought. Sam joked about something from school. Jack rolled his eyes, pretending not to laugh. Annie listened, smiling, occasionally adding a comment that brought everything back into balance. And Ben watched. He didn't say much. He didn't need to. Because in that moment, everything he had tried to express in his Instagram post, the gratitude, the admiration, the quiet awe, was right there in front of him. Alive, real, time, love, and what remains. Later that night, after the dishes were done and the house had settled into silence, Ben found himself once again by the window. The same place he had stood that morning. But now, the world felt different. Fuller. He thought about the years ahead, the changes still to come, the milestones yet to be reached. Their sons would leave home one day. The house would grow quieter. Life would shift again. But one thing would remain. Annie. The woman who had been there from the very beginning. The one who had seen him before the world did. The one who had stayed. A love that lasts. He turned as Annie entered the room, wrapping a light cardigan around herself. "Long day?" she asked. "Good day," he replied. She smiled, stepping closer. And for a moment, they stood there in comfortable silence, no need for words, no need for anything more. Because after all these years, they understood something that many spend a lifetime searching for. Love isn't just in the big moments. It's in the quiet ones. The unnoticed ones. The everyday ones. And sometimes, it's in a simple birthday post, shared with the world, but meant for just one person. As the night deepened and the house drifted into sleep, Ben glanced once more at his phone. The post had taken on a life of its own, likes, comments, messages pouring in. But none of that really mattered. Because the person it was meant for was right there beside him. And that, more than anything, was